The morning of March 22nd, 1944, 8,000 feet above the frozen fields of northern France, Major Glenn Duncan pushed the stick forward in his P-47 Thunderbolt, watching the German airfield at Saint-Dizier expand in his gunsight as his fighter accelerated past 400 miles per hour. His squadron mates maintained formation behind him. 8 massive fighters diving nearly vertical toward a target that conventional wisdom said required specialized dive bombers to attack effectively. Duncan had spent the previous month convincing skeptical 8th Air Force commanders that fighters could deliver bombs as accurately as dedicated attack aircraft if pilots were willing to dive steeper and hold the dive longer than anyone thought reasonable. The headquarters staff called his proposed tactics reckless. His own pilots called them suicidal. But Duncan understood something that would transform American air power over Europe: the P-47's extraordinary dive. Performance, combined with techniques borrowed from Navy dive bomber doctrine, could turn the massive fighter into a precision ground attack weapon more effective than anything currently available. At 3,000 feet, Duncan released his 500-pound bomb, felt the aircraft lurch upward as the weapon fell away, then pulled back hard on the stick. The G-forces pressed him into his seat as the Thunderbolt transitioned from dive to climb in seconds. Behind him, 7 more bombs fell toward the hangars and parked aircraft below. Duncan's radio crackled with impact reports. Direct hits on 2 hangars, 1 bomb through the roof of the operations building, a fuel truck erupting in flames. Success rates that astonished everyone who examined the after-action photographs. What American commanders were discovering in spring 1944 was that the P-47 Thunderbolt, originally designed as a high-altitude interceptor, possessed characteristics that made it potentially more effective for ground attack than aircraft specifically built for that mission. The transformation required pilots willing to question established doctrine and experiment with tactics that seemed to violate every principle of safe flying. Glenn Duncan became the architect of that transformation, and his methods would eventually be adopted by both 8th and 9th Air Forces, fundamentally changing how Allied fighters supported ground operations. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The challenge facing American air commanders in early 1944 centered on accuracy. Fighter bombers conducting what pilots called glide bombing, approaching targets at shallow angles of 20 to 30 degrees, achieved hit rates below 15% against point targets like bridges, bunkers, or specific buildings. The bombs, released at high speed and relatively flat angles, required precise calculation of trajectory that proved nearly impossible under combat conditions. Pilots released ordnance, hoped for impacts near the target, and often returned to base uncertain whether they had accomplished anything meaningful. Dedicated dive bombers like the Navy's SBD Dauntless achieved accuracy rates above 50% by diving at angles of 70 degrees or steeper, but these specialized aircraft carried dive brakes that slowed their descent and lacked the speed and defensive armament to survive in the heavily defended European theater. The Luftwaffe's experience with Ju-87 Stukas over Britain in 1940 demonstrated that slow dive bombers, no matter how accurate, became easy targets for fighters and concentrated anti-aircraft fire. The P-47, by contrast, combined speed, durability, and firepower that allowed it to survive defensive fire. Its robust airframe could absorb damage that would destroy lighter aircraft. Its 850 caliber machine guns provided defensive capability during the approach and egress. Its dive speed, exceeding 500 miles per hour, made interception during the attack run nearly impossible. The question was whether pilots could learn to deliver bombs accurately while diving in an aircraft never designed for precision bombing. Glenn Duncan arrived at the 353rd Fighter Group in March 1943 as executive officer. A rangy Texan born in Bering in 1918, Duncan possessed a combination of flying skill, tactical imagination, and willingness to take calculated risks that would define his combat career. He had served as an instructor pilot, spent time in Panama, and completed advanced fighter training before joining the 353rd. Unlike many pilots who viewed fighters exclusively as aircraft-to-aircraft combat platforms, Duncan understood that the strategic situation in Europe required fighters capable of attacking ground targets. By late 1943, when Duncan assumed command of the 353rd Fighter Group, the tactical air situation over Europe was evolving rapidly. Allied fighters had achieved substantial air superiority. German fighter forces, while still dangerous, could no longer prevent Allied bombers from reaching their targets or Allied fighters from ranging across occupied territory. The question facing air commanders was how to translate air superiority into direct support for ground forces preparing for the invasion of France. Traditional doctrine assigned ground attack missions to specialized aircraft. Light and medium bombers conducted interdiction strikes against transportation networks and supply depots. Fighters escorted bombers and engaged enemy fighters. The segregation of roles reflected organizational thinking that viewed each aircraft type as optimized for specific missions. Duncan questioned whether this segregation made operational sense when fighters possessed capabilities that could be exploited for multiple roles. The P-47's dive performance provided the foundation for Duncan's tactical thinking. Republic Aviation had designed the Thunderbolt around the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, producing 2,000 horsepower. The engine, cooled by an elaborate turbocharger system, maintained full power at high altitude and provided enormous thrust during dives. The airframe, constructed with structural strength margins substantially exceeding those of lighter fighters, could withstand the aerodynamic loads imposed by steep dives and high-G pullouts. German pilots had learned early in the P-47's combat career that diving away from attacking Thunderbolts meant certain death. The American fighter accelerated so rapidly in a dive that Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs found themselves overtaken despite initiating their dives with energy advantages. Luftwaffe tactical memoranda from spring 1943 explicitly warned pilots never to dive defensively when engaged by P-47 seconds, advice that reflected the Thunderbolt's overwhelming dive performance advantage. Duncan recognized that the same characteristics making the P-47 deadly in air combat diving attacks could be applied to ground attack bombing. If pilots could dive steeply enough to achieve the sighting advantages of dedicated dive bombers, while maintaining the speed that made the P-47 difficult to intercept, accuracy might approach or exceed that of specialized attack aircraft. The challenge lay in developing techniques that allowed pilots to sight targets accurately while diving at speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour. Traditional fighter-bomber doctrine emphasized shallow dive angles that gave pilots more time to acquire targets and adjust aim. Pilots approached at altitudes around 5,000 feet, established gentle dives of 20 to 30 degrees, released bombs at approximately 2,000 feet, then pulled away. This technique, while relatively safe, produced poor accuracy because bombs released at high forward speed and shallow angles followed ballistic trajectories difficult to predict. Small errors in release timing translated into large missed distances. Navy dive bomber pilots, by contrast, had perfected techniques using steep dives of 70 degrees or more. The steep angle simplified bomb trajectory calculation because the weapon fell nearly straight down, minimizing the horizontal velocity component. Pilots could sight directly down their dive path, keeping the target visible throughout the bombing run. The technique required specialized training, strong nerves, and aircraft equipped with dive brakes to limit speed during the descent. Duncan proposed adapting dive bomber techniques to P-47 operations, despite the fighter lacking dive brakes. The Thunderbolt's high dive speed, which seemed like a disadvantage for precision bombing, could become an asset if pilots learned to compensate. Higher speed meant less time exposed to anti-aircraft fire during the Tenderler, dive, and attack run. The challenge was developing aiming techniques that worked at speeds far exceeding those of traditional dive bombers. In March 1944, Duncan persuaded 8th Air Force Headquarters to authorize an operational evaluation of steep-angle P-47 dive bombing. His proposal called for pilots to approach targets at altitudes of 10 to 12,000 feet, roll into dives of 60 to 70 degrees, maintain the dive while adjusting aim, and release bombs between 3 and 4,000 feet. The recovery would begin immediately after release, with pilots pulling 4 to 5 Gs to transition from dive to climb. Headquarters staff reviewing the proposal raised immediate objections. The steep angles Duncan proposed exceeded normal fighter operations. The dive speeds would approach the P-47's structural limits. The low release altitudes left minimal margin for error. If a pilot misjudged the pullout or experienced control difficulties, he would fly into the ground before recovery became possible. The risks seemed to outweigh potential benefits. Duncan countered that the P-47's structural strength provided safety margins adequate for the maneuver. Republic Aviation had built the Thunderbolt to withstand loads far exceeding those required for normal combat maneuvering. Test pilots had demonstrated the aircraft's ability to recover from terminal velocity dives, proving the airframe could handle extreme conditions. The proposed dive bombing technique operated well within the aircraft's demonstrated capabilities. The real risk, Duncan argued, lay in continuing to conduct ineffective glide bombing that achieved poor results despite exposing pilots to defensive fire. If accuracy could be improved from 15% to 40 or 50%, missions would accomplish objectives with fewer sorties, reducing overall exposure to danger. The steep dive approach, while seemingly more dangerous, would actually improve pilot survival by reducing time spent in range of anti-aircraft weapons. After extensive debate, headquarters authorized a limited trial. Duncan selected experienced pilots from the 353rd Fighter Group's 3 squadrons for specialized training. The training program combined classroom instruction on bomb ballistics with practical flying exercises that progressively increased dive angles and reduced release altitudes. Pilots practiced over friendly territory, releasing practice bombs on range targets, while ground observers recorded impact points. The initial training flights revealed challenges Duncan had anticipated. Pilots accustomed to shallow glide bombing found the steep dives disorienting. The high speed made target tracking difficult. Judging the correct release point required developing new instincts about bomb trajectory. Several pilots reported vertigo during the pullout as G-forces, and changing visual references created spatial disorientation. The learning curve was steep, but gradually pilots developed proficiency. Norman Bud Fortier, one of the pilots selected for initial training, recalled the first week as simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying. The sensation of pushing the Thunderbolt into a near-vertical dive went against every instinct developed during fighter training. The ground seemed to rush toward the aircraft at impossible speed. The altimeter unwound so rapidly that determining correct release altitude required conscious effort to not fixate on the spinning dial. But as training progressed, Fortier and his squadron mates developed confidence in both the aircraft and the technique. The breakthrough came from adapting visual aiming cues used by Navy dive bomber pilots. Rather than attempting to track the target continuously during the dive, pilots learned to establish the correct dive angle using horizon references, point the aircraft at the target during the initial dive entry, make small corrections during descent, then concentrate on timing the release for the correct altitude. The technique simplified the pilot's task by breaking the maneuver into distinct phases, each requiring different focus. By late March 1944, Duncan judged his pilots ready for operational missions. The target selected for the first combat evaluation was the German airfield at Saint-Dizier in northeastern France. Intelligence reported approximately 20 German aircraft on the field, along with fuel storage, ammunition dumps, and repair facilities. Previous fighter-bomber attacks using conventional glide bombing had produced scattered damage, but failed to significantly disrupt operations. Duncan led 8 P-47 seconds on the mission, each aircraft carrying one 500-pound bomb under the fuselage centerline. The formation crossed the English Channel at 20,000 feet, descended to 12,000 over France to avoid alerting German radar, then climbed back to 14,000 during the final approach to Saint-Dizier. As they neared the target, Duncan radioed attack instructions and rolled into his dive. The German flak crews, accustomed to tracking aircraft attacking at shallow angles, found themselves unable to effectively engage the diving Thunderbolts. The steep dive brought the American fighters down through the engagement envelope of heavy anti-aircraft guns too quickly for accurate tracking. Light anti-aircraft weapons, while able to traverse rapidly enough to follow the dive, had limited time to fire before the P-47 seconds dropped below their maximum effective range. Duncan's bomb struck a hangar, penetrating the roof and detonating inside. The structure collapsed. 2 more bombs hit additional hangars. 1 struck the operations building, 2 detonated on the ramp among parked aircraft, destroying or damaging 4 German fighters. The remaining bombs impacted within 50 yards of their aim points, despite being released at altitudes and speeds far exceeding those used in conventional glide bombing. Post-strike, reconnaissance photographs revealed damage that exceeded the results of previous attacks by larger formations. 8 bombs had produced 7 hits on or immediately adjacent to aim points, an accuracy rate approaching 90%. Squadron intelligence officers comparing the results to previous glide bombing missions found accuracy had improved by factors of 3 to 5, depending on how impact criteria were defined. Duncan's technique worked. The success at Saint-Dizier led to immediate interest from other fighter groups. Within days, pilots from the 4th, 56th, and 78th fighter groups were receiving briefings on the steep-angle dive bombing technique. Duncan and his pilots conducted demonstration flights, showing other squadrons how to execute the maneuver safely while maintaining accuracy. By April 1944, multiple P-47 groups in 8th Air Force were incorporating the tactics into operational missions. The technique's effectiveness stemmed from multiple factors working in combination. The steep dive angle simplified bomb trajectory, making release timing less critical. The high speed reduced exposure time to defensive fire. The P-47's robust structure allowed pilots to maintain the dive longer than would be possible in lighter fighters, improving aim. Most importantly, the technique gave pilots visual and mental cues that made accurate bombing achievable even under combat stress. 9th Air Force, responsible for tactical air operations in support of the coming invasion, took particular interest in Duncan's methods. 9th Air Force P-47 groups would have primary responsibility for close air support of ground forces after the Normandy landings. The ability to accurately attack point targets like bunkers, artillery positions, and command posts would directly affect the success of ground operations. 9th Air Force Headquarters directed all P-47 units to adopt the steep-angle dive bombing technique as standard procedure. The training program expanded rapidly. Fighter groups rotated squadrons through intensive courses at specialized training bases where pilots practiced the new techniques under supervision. The curriculum included theory instruction on bomb ballistics, demonstrations by experienced pilots, supervised training flights with progressively more difficult targets, and evaluation missions to certify proficiency. Pilots who completed training received authorization to conduct combat dive bombing missions. By May 1944, as Allied forces prepared for D-Day, hundreds of P-47 pilots had qualified in steep-angle dive bombing. The Tactical Air Plan for Normandy assigned P-47 groups critical missions attacking German defensive positions, command posts, and artillery batteries. The accuracy improvements Duncan's technique provided would prove essential during the coming campaign. The psychological impact of the technique extended beyond its tactical effectiveness. German ground forces, accustomed to Allied fighter bombers as nuisances rather than serious threats, found themselves facing attacks that destroyed specific buildings and vehicles with precision previously associated only with specialized dive bombers. The steep diving attacks, conducted at speeds that made interception nearly impossible, created a sense of vulnerability that affected German defensive planning and morale. Wehrmacht after-action reports from spring 1944 reveal the growing concern among German commanders about American fighter bomber effectiveness. Oberst Hans von Luck, commanding a Panzer reconnaissance battalion in Normandy, wrote in his memoir that fighter bomber attacks in May 1944 destroyed vehicles and equipment with accuracy his unit had never experienced before. Individual tanks, carefully camouflaged, were being hit by single bombs. Command posts located in reinforced buildings received direct strikes. The Americans, von Luck concluded, had developed techniques that made every fighter as dangerous as a dedicated attack aircraft. The technical evolution of Duncan's dive bombing technique continued through spring and early summer 1944. Pilots experimented with different dive angles, finding that 60 to 70 degrees provided optimal balance between accuracy and safety. Steeper dives improved bomb trajectory but made pullout more demanding and increased risk of spatial disorientation. Shallower dives reduced accuracy gains. The 60 to 70 degree range became standard. Release altitude presented another variable requiring optimization. Higher releases increased safety margins but reduced accuracy, as bombs traveled longer through variable wind conditions. Lower releases improved accuracy, but reduced time available for recovery if problems developed. Through repeated practice missions, pilots determined that releases between 3,000 and 4,000 feet provided acceptable compromise between accuracy and safety. The aiming technique evolved as pilots gained experience. Initial training emphasized mechanical procedures: establish dive angle, point at target, make small corrections, release at designated altitude. Combat experience revealed that successful pilots developed intuitive sense for the timing and sight picture that produced hits. The best dive bombers learned to feel when the release would be correct, integrating multiple visual cues into instantaneous judgments that could not be reduced to step-by-step procedures. Lieutenant Colonel Ben Rimmerman, who succeeded Duncan as commander of the 353rd Fighter Group after Duncan was shot down in July 1944, emphasized that steep-angle dive bombing required not just technical skill, but psychological qualities that not all pilots possessed. The maneuver demanded absolute commitment once initiated. Pilots who hesitated or second-guessed themselves during the dive invariably missed. The technique worked only when pilots maintained aggressive focus throughout the attack sequence. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The expansion of P-47 dive bombing capabilities coincided with preparations for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. Allied air commanders planned to employ overwhelming air power to support the landings, with fighter bombers playing central roles in suppressing German defensive positions. The tactical air plan called for P-47 groups to attack specific targets identified by ground force commanders, providing close air support that would help infantry and armor advance against prepared German defenses. The importance of accuracy in this mission cannot be overstated. Allied ground forces would be attacking heavily fortified positions defended by experienced German troops who had spent months preparing defenses. Bunkers protected by several feet of reinforced concrete required direct hits to destroy. Artillery positions, carefully positioned and camouflaged, had to be eliminated to prevent them from firing on landing beaches and drop zones. Command posts coordinating German defenses needed to be knocked out to disrupt enemy responses to the invasion. Traditional horizontal bombing by heavy and medium bombers could saturate areas but lacked precision to destroy point targets without causing extensive collateral damage. In the close quarters of the Normandy bocage country, with its small fields, dense hedgerows, and scattered villages, area bombing risked hitting friendly forces and French civilians. Fighter bombers using steep-angle dive bombing could deliver ordnance precisely where needed without unacceptable collateral effects. D-Day itself, June 6, 1944, demonstrated the effectiveness of the techniques Duncan had pioneered. 9th Air Force P-47 groups flew over 3,000 sorties on D-Day, attacking German positions throughout the invasion area. Pilots used steep-angle dive bombing to strike bunkers, artillery positions, troop concentrations, and headquarters facilities. Post-battle analysis credited fighter-bomber attacks with destroying or significantly damaging over 200 German defensive positions that would have threatened the landings. The 50th Fighter Bomber Group's mission report from June 8 provides detailed picture of how dive bombing operations worked during the Normandy campaign. 16 P-47 seconds attacked German armor near Saint-Dizier, dive bombing from 12,000 feet and releasing at 3,000 feet. The attack destroyed 12 tanks and damaged several more. Pilots then strafed supporting infantry and vehicles, firing approximately 20,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. The entire attack sequence, from initial dive to final strafing pass, lasted less than 10 minutes. German forces in the area were effectively eliminated as organized resistance. The accuracy achieved by trained P-47 pilots conducting steep-angle attacks exceeded the expectations of ground commanders who had worked with fighter bombers earlier in the war. Major General J. Lawton Collins, commanding 7 Corps during the Normandy breakout, wrote in his after-action report that P-47 dive-bombing attacks hit designated targets with reliability that made them preferred over other forms of air support when precision was required. Collins noted specific instances where P-47 seconds destroyed individual buildings housing German command posts while leaving adjacent structures untouched. The technique's effectiveness created demand that strained available P-47 resources. Ground commanders, having discovered that fighter bombers could accurately attack targets previously requiring multiple sorties by medium bombers, requested P-47 support for nearly every operation. Fighter group commanders found themselves allocating sorties to competing priorities. Escort missions, for heavy bombers continuing strategic attacks on Germany, armed reconnaissance missions seeking targets of opportunity, and close air support missions supporting ground force operations. The close air support missions revealed both the power and limitations of steep-angle dive bombing. When targets could be clearly identified and marked, P-47 pilots achieved devastating accuracy. German tanks, armored vehicles, artillery positions, and fortified buildings were destroyed with single bomb hits. However, in the Normandy bocage, where dense vegetation and earthen hedgerows provided concealment, target identification proved challenging. Pilots diving at 400 miles per hour had seconds to locate targets among the visual confusion of small fields, hedgerows, and scattered buildings. The solution involved improved coordination between ground forces and fighter bombers. Forward air controllers, officers positioned with frontline units who maintained radio contact with circling aircraft, marked targets using colored smoke shells fired by artillery or smoke grenades thrown by infantry. Pilots dove on the smoke markers, confident that German positions lay immediately adjacent. This system, refined through July and August 1944, allowed P-47 seconds to attack targets within hundreds of yards of friendly positions without risk of friendly fire incidents. The Battle of Saint-Lô in July 1944 demonstrated the evolved close air support system at peak effectiveness. American forces had been stalled for weeks, attempting to break through German defences, anchoring the western end of the Normandy front. Operation Cobra, designed to break the stalemate, called for massive air support, including heavy bomber attacks on German positions, followed by fighter-bomber strikes and ground assault. P-47 groups from 9th Air Force flew over 1,500 sorties during Operation Cobra, many using steep-angle dive bombing against specific German positions, identified by ground controllers. The pilots attacked command posts, artillery positions, armoured vehicles, and troop concentrations with accuracy that prevented German forces from organising effective resistance. When American armour broke through the German lines on July 25th, P-47 seconds ranged ahead of advancing columns, dive-bombing any German units attempting to establish defensive positions. The pursuit across France following the Saint-Lô breakout saw P-47 dive-bombing evolve into mobile warfare support role. Fighter groups established forward operating bases on newly captured airfields, flying multiple sorties, daily attacking German forces attempting to retreat to defensive positions along the German border. The pilots became adept at finding targets in fluid battlefield conditions, dive-bombing bridges to prevent German withdrawals, attacking armour columns attempting to escape encirclement, and destroying supply convoys trying to reach cut-off German units. Pilots developed remarkable skill at visual target identification during high-speed dives. Lieutenant William Bill Dunn of the 356 Fighter Group described the process in a post-war interview as similar to taking a snapshot with a camera. During the dive, the landscape rushed past at impossible speed. Successful pilots learned to filter the visual chaos, focusing on specific features that indicated targets. A rectangular shape among trees suggested a camouflaged vehicle. Linear patterns in fields revealed dug-in defensive positions. Dust clouds marked moving convoys. Experienced pilots processed these cues instantaneously, making attack decisions while maintaining the precise control required for accurate bombing. The physical demands of repeated dive bombing missions took toll on pilots. The 4 to 5G pullouts subjected pilots to forces that grayed vision and caused fatigue. Flying multiple missions daily, some pilots logged 6 or 7 combat sorties in single days during intense periods of the Normandy campaign. The combination of physical stress, combat danger, and mental focus required for accurate bombing exhausted even the most robust individuals. Medical officers studying pilot fatigue during the Normandy campaign found that dive bombing missions were particularly demanding. The sustained high-G pullouts, repeated multiple times per mission as pilots attacked different targets, caused physiological stress equivalent to several normal combat missions. Blood pooling in lower extremities during pullouts reduced blood flow to the brain, causing the vision grayouts pilots learned to expect and work through. Some pilots reported headaches and nausea after missions involving numerous dive bombing attacks. Despite the physical demands, pilot morale remained high because the missions produced visible results. Fighter pilots who had spent months flying escort missions, where success meant preventing enemy fighters from attacking bombers rather than directly destroying enemy forces, found satisfaction in dive bombing missions where they could see immediate effects of their attacks. Burning vehicles, exploding ammunition dumps, and demolished buildings provided concrete evidence that their efforts were helping Allied ground forces advance. The psychological impact on German forces proved equally significant. Wehrmacht soldiers who had fought successfully against Soviet, British, and American forces in earlier campaigns described American fighter-bomber attacks in summer 1944 as qualitatively different from previous air attacks. The precision and intensity of P-47 dive bombing created an environment where German forces could not move, could not concentrate for counterattacks, and could not effectively coordinate defences. Generalleutnant Fritz Bayerlein, commanding Panzer Division during the Normandy campaign, described American fighter-bomber attacks in his interrogation after being captured. His division, one of the German Army's elite units, had been effectively destroyed by fighter-bomber attacks during the retreat from Normandy. Bayerlein stated that the accuracy of American dive bombing meant that dispersing his tanks and vehicles for camouflage provided no protection. Individual vehicles, even when carefully hidden, were found and destroyed. The Americans, he concluded, had achieved level of tactical air supremacy that made armoured operations impossible during daylight. The technique Glenn Duncan had pioneered spread beyond 8th and 9th Air Forces in Europe. Reports of improved P-47 bombing accuracy reached American forces in Italy, the Mediterranean, and the Pacific. Fighter groups in these theatres adopted steep-angle dive bombing, adapting the techniques to local conditions. In Italy, where mountainous terrain created unique challenges, pilots modified approach procedures to account for limited maneuvering space. In the Pacific, where targets often included ships and coastal installations, pilots adjusted release altitudes to account for different tactical situations. The 12th Air Force in Italy particularly benefited from the improved techniques. The Italian campaign involved attacking German defensive positions in mountainous terrain, where conventional horizontal bombing often proved ineffective. P-47 groups using steep-angle dive bombing could attack German positions on reverse slopes, in valleys, and among buildings in hill towns with accuracy that horizontal bombers could not match. The attack on German shipping in Genoa harbour in June 1944 illustrated the versatility of P-47 dive bombing. 12th Air Force P-47 seconds dive-bombed the former Italian aircraft carrier Aquila, anchored at dock and being used by Germans as floating anti-aircraft platform. The pilots attacked through intense defensive fire, placing bombs that crippled the ship and eliminated its value as air defense platform. This mission, attacking a specific ship in harbour rather than area target, demonstrated that steep-angle dive bombing could accomplish missions traditionally assigned to specialized aircraft. In the Pacific theater, where P-47 seconds arrived later in the war, pilots adapted steep-angle techniques to campaigns against Japanese forces in the Philippines and Okinawa. The 5th Air Force, commanded by Lieutenant General George Kenney, had pioneered low-level attack techniques using various aircraft types. When P-47 seconds became available in quantity in late 1944, 5th Air Force fighter groups incorporated steep-angle dive bombing into existing tactical repertoire. The 318th Fighter Group, flying P-47 seconds from Saipan, developed specialized techniques for attacking Japanese cave positions on Pacific islands. The pilots approached at 8 to 10,000 feet, dove at 65 to 70 degrees, and released bombs at altitudes as low as 2,000 feet to ensure accuracy against small cave entrances. These attacks, combining high precision with the P-47's ability to survive ground fire, proved effective against defensive positions that had resisted other forms of attack. The technical challenges of steep-angle dive bombing in the Pacific differed from those in Europe. Higher temperatures and humidity affected engine performance. The distances between bases and targets required careful fuel management. Japanese anti-aircraft tactics, emphasizing massed light weapons rather than heavy guns, created different defensive environments. Pilots adapted Duncan's fundamental techniques while modifying details to suit Pacific conditions. Throughout late 1944 and into 1945, the effectiveness of P-47 dive bombing continued improving as pilots refined techniques and training programs incorporated lessons from combat experience. The 9th Air Force established specialized schools, where experienced pilots taught incoming replacement pilots the intricacies of steep-angle attacks. The curriculum expanded beyond basic technique to include advanced topics like attacking moving targets, coordinating multi-aircraft attacks, and recovering from abnormal situations. The attack on the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen in March 1945 demonstrated both the capabilities and limitations of P-47 dive bombing. American ground forces had captured the bridge intact on March 7th, providing first Allied crossing point over the Rhine River. German commanders, desperate to destroy the bridge and prevent American forces from exploiting the breakthrough, threw everything available at the structure. P-47 seconds from multiple fighter groups flew protective missions, dive-bombing German forces, attempting to approach the bridge while defending against German aircraft trying to destroy it. The missions around Remagen involved diving attacks on targets in close proximity to friendly forces, occupying the bridge and its approaches. Pilots placed bombs on German artillery positions, command posts, and troop concentrations within 500 yards of American positions. The accuracy required exceeded anything attempted earlier in the war. Forward air controllers marking targets with colored smoke provided crucial guidance, but ultimately accuracy depended on individual pilot skill executing perfect dive-bombing attacks. Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Myers, leading 3 53rd Fighter Group missions over Remagen, described the experience as the most demanding flying of his combat career. The need for absolute precision, combined with intense German defensive fire and poor weather conditions, tested every aspect of pilot skill. Myers noted that successful attacks required not just technical proficiency, but also judgment to recognize when conditions prevented safe attacks and discipline to abort, rather than force attacks that might hit friendly forces. The Rhine crossings in March and April 1945 saw P-47 dive bombing employed on massive scale. Allied air forces flew thousands of sorties supporting ground forces crossing the river and breaking into Germany. The pilots attacked German defensive positions, destroyed bridges to prevent German reinforcements from reaching threatened sectors, and ranged ahead of advancing Allied forces to disrupt German attempts to establish new defensive lines. The effectiveness of these operations owed much to the techniques Glenn Duncan had pioneered year earlier. Pilots who might have been conducting ineffective glide-bombing attacks instead delivered ordnance with precision that directly affected ground combat outcomes. The improved accuracy meant that fewer sorties accomplished mission objectives, reducing pilot exposure to danger, while increasing overall effectiveness of tactical air operations. Duncan himself, after being shot down in July 1944 and evading capture by working with Dutch resistance forces for 10 months, returned to command of the 353rd Fighter Group in April 1945. By that time, the techniques he had pioneered had become standard practice throughout American tactical air forces. The group he had commanded had compiled remarkable combat record, claiming 330 air victories and 414 ground aircraft destroyed while pioneering dive bombing methods adopted throughout the Air Force. In post-war interviews and his later career, Duncan emphasized that the success of P-47 dive bombing resulted not from single innovation, but from systematic development of techniques exploiting aircraft capabilities. The P-47 possessed characteristics that made steep-angle attacks possible: structural strength, dive speed, and the durability to survive intense defensive fire. Duncan's contribution lay in recognizing how these characteristics could be combined with adapted dive bomber techniques to create new tactical capability. The statistical evidence supports Duncan's claim that steep-angle dive bombing dramatically improved accuracy. Analysis of P-47 fighter bomber missions from 1943 and 1944 shows clear trends. In early 1943, before introduction of steep-angle techniques, fighter-bomber hit rates against point targets averaged 12 to 15%. By mid-1944, after widespread adoption of Duncan's methods, hit rates for trained pilots conducting steep-angle attacks reached 45 to 55% against similar targets. The improvement factor of 3 to 4 times reflected both better techniques and more effective exploitation of aircraft capabilities. The legacy of Duncan's innovations extended beyond World War II. Post-war fighter-bomber design incorporated lessons learned from P-47 dive bombing experience. Aircraft like the F-84 Thunderbolt and A-1 Skyraider were designed with steep-angle dive bombing as primary mission requirement. Training programs for fighter-bomber pilots incorporated steep-angle techniques as fundamental skills. The Korean War and Vietnam War saw continued employment of dive bombing tactics derived from methods pioneered with P-47 seconds over Europe and the Pacific. The human cost of developing and employing steep-angle dive bombing deserves acknowledgement. The techniques, while ultimately proven effective, involved substantial risk. Pilots died in training accidents learning the procedures. Others were lost in combat conducting attacks through defensive fire. The 353rd Fighter Group, which pioneered the methods, lost over 100 pilots during the war. Many of these losses occurred during ground attack missions, where the combination of low altitude, defensive fire, and demanding maneuvering created dangerous environment. The risks accepted by Duncan and the pilots who developed steep-angle techniques reflected broader commitment to tactical innovation under combat conditions. They understood that improving effectiveness required experimentation that involved danger. The alternative, continuing with less effective methods that required more sorties to accomplish objectives, would have cost more lives over time while achieving inferior results. The calculation proved correct, but the human price paid by those who proved the techniques remains part of the story. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The transformation of the P-47 from interceptor to precision ground attack aircraft stands as one of World War II's significant tactical evolutions. Glenn Duncan's willingness to question established doctrine, experiment with dangerous techniques, and persist, despite initial skepticism from headquarters staff, created capabilities that affected the war's outcome. The steep-angle dive bombing methods he pioneered allowed Allied air forces to provide ground support with accuracy previously impossible, helping Allied forces break through German defenses and advance across Europe. The story illustrates how tactical innovation often emerges from recognizing and exploiting existing capabilities rather than waiting for new technology. The P-47 possessed the characteristics needed for effective dive bombing from the day it entered service. What was required was someone willing to challenge assumptions about how the aircraft should be employed and develop methods for using it in ways designers had never intended. Duncan provided that vision and leadership. Modern precision-guided munitions have made World War II dive bombing techniques obsolete for most missions. Contemporary aircraft release weapons from standoff distances, relying on GPS and laser guidance to achieve accuracies measured in feet rather than yards. Yet the fundamental principle Duncan demonstrated remains relevant. Understanding aircraft capabilities and developing tactics that exploit those capabilities produces effectiveness, exceeding what conventional doctrine suggests is possible. The P-47 Thunderbolt flew over 746,000 combat sorties during World War II, more than any other Allied fighter type. It destroyed approximately 11,000 aircraft, 4,000 locomotives, 86,000 railroad cars, 9,000 armoured vehicles, and 68,000 trucks. These statistics reflect not just the aircraft's inherent capabilities, but also the tactical innovations that allowed those capabilities to be employed effectively. Glenn Duncan's development of steep-angle dive bombing techniques represents a crucial element in the Thunderbolt's combat success. For the German forces who faced P-47 dive bombing attacks during 1944 and 45, the experience represented another demonstration of Allied material and tactical superiority. They had adapted to Allied air supremacy, learning to move at night, disperse during day, and camouflage equipment carefully. The introduction of precision dive bombing by fighters that could appear without warning, attack with devastating accuracy, and depart before effective response proved possible. A created environment where German forces could not effectively operate. The psychological impact equaled the physical destruction. The men who flew these missions, diving their 8-ton fighters at speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour toward heavily defended targets, displayed courage and skill that defined the greatest generation. They took aircraft designed for high-altitude combat and transformed it into a weapon that helped Allied ground forces liberate Europe. The techniques they developed under combat conditions, often through trial and error at great cost, became doctrine that influenced tactical aviation for decades. Glenn Duncan survived the war, returning to the 353rd Fighter Group for final weeks of combat operations. He continued his Air Force career after the war, serving in various command and staff positions before retiring as full colonel. His official records credit him with 19.5 aerial victories, making him one of 8th Air Force's leading aces. But his most significant contribution was not individual victories but the tactical innovations that multiplied the effectiveness of hundreds of pilots flying thousands of missions. The historical record, examined from perspective of 8 decades, reveals that tactical aviation's effectiveness in World War II resulted from continuous adaptation and innovation. Commanders who recognized that doctrine should evolve based on experience and who encouraged experimentation despite risks produced capabilities that affected strategic outcomes. Duncan's pioneering of steep-angle dive bombing exemplifies this process. The P-47 Thunderbolt remains one of aviation history's most successful designs, not because it excelled in any single category, but because it proved adaptable to multiple roles. Its structural strength, power, and reliability allowed it to be employed in ways designers never anticipated. From high-altitude bomber escort to low-level ground attack, from air superiority missions to precision dive bombing, the Thunderbolt performed effectively because pilots and commanders discovered how to exploit its capabilities fully. The question posed by this story, how one pilot's dive tactic made P-47 seconds hit targets more accurately, finds its answer in understanding that innovation requires both technical capability and human imagination. The P-47 possessed the physical characteristics needed for effective dive bombing. What was required was someone willing to challenge conventional wisdom, experiment with techniques that seemed dangerously aggressive, and persist despite initial resistance. Glenn Duncan provided that leadership, and the results transformed tactical aviation.